Hello and welcome to the ROPESCAST, the independent voice of the Middle East. I am your host, Ksenia Svetlova. ROPE stands for the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security. We are a young organization dedicated to laying the groundwork for a post-conflict Middle East. And we do that by connecting forward-thinking Israelis, Palestinians, with like-minded peers across the Middle East. At ROPES, we share a holistic vision for our region, one where every individual has far more to gain from regional integration and conflict resolution than they have to lose. For more information on our work, please visit our website, ropes.org. And joining us today is a very special guest. I know that every guest of ROPESCAST is special, but believe me, this one truly is. This is Elizabeth Tsurkov. Elizabeth is an Israeli-Russian researcher, doctoral candidate at Princeton University, and one of the most sharp analysts of the Arab world, especially on everything going on Syria, Iraq, and sectarianism in the Middle East. In March 2023, she was kidnapped in Baghdad by the Iranian-backed militia, Hezbollah, while conducting field research, and held for unbelievable 903 days before being released in September 2025. She has written for the New York Times, The Washington Post, Haaretz, and 97.2 magazine. She speaks Arabic fluently. Liz, so good to see you. And
it's my pleasure.
Welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure, truly.
So, I was just saying right now, oh my God, like after all of this time, what can I ask you? So I think I will just start with the very basics. How are you?
I'm health-wise not great because of the consequences of the torture. So I go to the hospital twice a week in Israel, Shiva Hospital, to undergo care, and I'm hoping to improve. Right now, I'm quite restricted in basically what I can do because of the disc herniations that were caused by the torture. But I'm, not letting it stop me. I am working on my dissertation. I spent a lot of time thinking about my dissertation in captivity, and didn't, get a chance to write it except on pieces of paper and pieces of cardboard that I could find, and therefore now I'm finally able to, produce this into being. And so I've been working on my dissertation and also, doing some interviews and writing for a general audience. But really, my main focus is the dissertation these days.
Yeah, so for all of the doctoral candidates that are dragging, their work for years, all I can tell you, look at her, look at this amazing lady that while in captivity, she was working on her dissertation. I mean, like, oh my God. But of course, your dissertation is very closely connected to the world that you experience during this time. So maybe you can tell us, in brief words and try to make it simple because, people will be listening from all across the Middle East and, they are not necessarily experts on the Middle East, So what is it that you're writing on?
So my dissertation focuses on Lebanon and Iraq. Both countries have political systems that are what is termed in political science clientelistic political systems. In Arabic, it's رعية أو زبائنية. And that means basically political systems where people overwhelmingly vote for the party that provides them with material benefit of some kind. So usually state employment, but also other benefits. It can be health services. It can be blankets are given in Iraq. It can be also cash straight up on election day. So there's widespread selling of votes on election day in both countries. And according to the literature in political science, basically within these systems, voters should be looking for the party that can provide them the most. And when they find that party, they should be switching to it. And what I'm seeking to explain is how come in both Iraq and in Lebanon, there are parties that don't fit this existing kind of common sense idea that people will gravitate towards the party that provides them the most. And my research in Iraq focuses on the Sadrist current. It's a Shia religious political movement. Basically, as a Shia voter in Iraq, you would benefit a lot more if you switch to parties that are pro-Iran. So whether they're political parties or militias, because you're able to gain employment in the state to a much greater extent and more illicit benefits from being in a militia. And yet people remain loyal to the Sadrist movement. In fact, until they quit parliament in 2022, they were the largest party in parliament, winning 73 seats. So I'm trying to explain this phenomenon. And in Lebanon, my case study is the Lebanese Forces, which is a Christian party. And again, in the case of Christians in Lebanon, parties that were more aligned with Iran or Syria of Assad were really the ones dominating state employment until quite recently. And at least until the economic crisis of 2019, this was the main method of distributing patronage, of distributing clientelistic goods. And yet people, instead of voting for the parties that are more aligned with Syria or Iran or Hezbollah, and are therefore more politically dominant, like the Free Patriotic Movement and kind of smaller pro-Syria parties, instead attach themselves to the Lebanese forces. And in fact, the Lebanese forces continues to grow in the numbers of their supporters. So I'm trying to explain this phenomenon that is basically not really explained in the existing literature on political science.
But this is so interesting, because I think that the issue of corruption and politics and elections, basically it speaks to everyone in the modern world. Also, if we are living in a democracy where we unfortunately do know, how some of the deals are being made, and there is also the systems of patronage, of course, here in Israel, and so on, but what you are saying is basically there is hope, because not everything can be bought for money. And not everybody is willing to sell their vote, for gold or protection or anything like this.
That's true. I don't know if the story ends up being optimistic, because you basically have individuals who believe that they're supporting parties that are fighting for a certain cause, and are in their perception and in their kind of official narrative are in opposition to the existing system. But in reality, they serve to buttress the system because they participate in it. Overwhelmingly, both the Lebanese forces and the Sadrist movement have participated in basically multiple governments in both Lebanon and Iraq, and have helped basically to garner more votes and more participants in the political game to these systems that are utterly corrupt and are not serving the population of either Lebanon or Iraq.
But this is the eternal discussion on whether you can really promote some kind of change from within, whether it's better to still be part of the system. For example, I know that opposition parties in Russia always had this internal debate, or it's better to withdraw altogether and just leave this, the whole thing to, let's say, call them the bad ones, the most corrupt ones.
Yeah, that's definitely the argument that supporters of these parties make for participating in politics. I do think that in both countries, the participation has to do more with dividing up the cake of the benefits that exist from participating in government. So having ministries, having sources of revenue and ability to distribute to your supporters, and less to do with what they claim to be, which are these reformist oppositional voices. I do think that, in the case of Lebanon and in the case of Iraq, in October 2019, protests erupted in both countries that lasted into 2020 that sought to topple the existing regimes. And in both cases, members of elections were held, and in 2021 and 2022 in Iraq and Lebanon, respectively. And members of parliament who were carried on this wave of protests entered parliament and then tried to change from within. Definitely in Iraq, the result has been really, really terrible. They've really been unable to change anything. And they have instead overwhelmingly been co-opted by the existing parties and essentially bought off, owing to really the immense oil money that exists in Iraq. In Lebanon, this is not the case as much, maybe because there is less political money, maybe there is a different reason. I initially wanted to research both movements, but ended up realizing that the theory I held was wrong, and therefore switched to researching the Lebanese forces and the Sadrists. But in Lebanon, these more reformist MPs have struggled really to change much about the country. The country is still in a very, very deep crisis. But this also stems from the fact that the country entered Hezbollah dragged the country repeatedly into wars, and it makes it very hard to advance any reform agenda. But these MPs were able to, they essentially serve as kind of a major support bloc for the current prime minister of Lebanon, Nawaf Salam, who is a very, very distinguished lawyer. He is very much hated in Israel for pursuing cases against Israel for grave human rights abuses perpetrated by the Israeli military and the Israeli occupation. But he's really someone who is kind of outside of the typical.
Definitely touch on what is happening in Lebanon a little bit later.
Yeah.
But before that,
so he very much came to power owing to this block of reformist MPs, and he's indeed really someone who is very, very different from the kind of usual suspects that become prime ministers in Lebanon. He's has no record whatsoever of being corrupt, which is a very beneficial thing for Lebanese, because every time you have scandals and corruption and he also doesn't follow any kind of a specific country. For example, in the case of Saad Hariri, he was clearly, following Saudi Arabia, while, Najib Mikati, for example, was following very much Hezbollah and, Iran and Assad Syria.
By the way, talking about the corruption scandals, you, of course, did not miss the recent corruption, I would say, it's more than a scandal, so because it was such a huge operation of the governmental forces against the MPs in Iraqi parliament. And of course, there was this woman with a golden set of underwear that made all of the noise around it, but the thing that it's, it's very interesting, because Iraq and you live there, how deep, this operation can really go. Will they really touch the most corrupt entities, elements, uprooted?
Yeah, so these photos obviously from these busts have gone viral, and some of them are definitely real, showing gold and showing cash. I'm not entirely sure about the underwear. It could be made with AI, but these MPs are all horribly corrupt and thieves who are basically leeching off of the coffers of the Iraqi state and the riches that belong to all the people of Iraq. Thus far, the arrests have been very targeted at Sudanese milieu, so basically the former prime minister.
The former PM, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So his people who are close to him have been arrested. And the same thing happened after Al-Kadhimi, the previous prime minister, was replaced by a Sudani. A Sudani went after people close to Al-Kadhimi. So this is becoming kind of a tradition where you want to basically destroy the corruption networks to sustain the support base for your political rival in a way. Mm-hmm. And the other really kind of a major targeted entity is the Azam coalition, which is a Sunni party. Thus far, we have not seen significant arrests beyond this. If it stays this way, this is obviously utterly insufficient. What matters really is that the systemic factors that contribute to corruption in Iraq are tackled with. So one really major source of corruption in Iraq are the economic offices that are operated by all the militias. By every single one of them has these economic offices that run, basically, they draw out of state coffers billions of dollars every year into their own coffers and also into the coffers of the Iranian regime and help sustain it. Because the relationship between the Iraqi militias and the Iranian regime is very different from the relationship between Tehran and Hezbollah, for example. Hezbollah is dependent on Iranian assistance. The Iraqi militias are not only not dependent on Iran, they help sustain the Iranian regime. and help smuggle dollars into Iran, and help smuggle oil out of Iran, and smuggle dual-use goods, etc., into Iran. So thus far, there's been absolutely no sign that this anti-corruption campaign is going to touch on prominent personalities that are major hubs of corruption, like Nouri al-Maliki.
That's unfortunately what I thought. When I saw this bus, I'm like, okay, they're going for okay, they are very rich people, obviously, but this is like small fish.
Yeah, if you go after corrupt politicians in Iraq, all of them would be jailed, including the current prime minister. His only experience in politics is buying off politicians before entering office. He basically would get government contracts through bribing officials, and I know this from people who know him personally and know his dealings. So no politician would be out of prison right now if you go after corrupt politicians in Iraq.
Yeah, kind of a problem here. And also, I wanted to ask you, because I in my time as a journalist, I had a chance to visit quite a few Arab countries, but Iraq was not one of them. I came very close in 2003 when the war against Iraq started, and I eventually, I covered, the war from the American carrier, and so on, and I was in Bahrain. But then, my television station that I worked for, they decided that enough is enough, and they brought me back home before I had a chance to go to Iraq. And then I missed my chance. So for the sake of those of us who haven't been there, is Iraq a poor country? Because, you lived there, you visited also quite a few times. You were there in the hospital. How do things bring us to us, like the sense of, this country that is oil-rich country, it could be like Dubai or something, I think, because of the natural riches and its geopolitical position and all of that. How the life looks like in Iraq?
Yeah. So Iraq obviously is very rich with resources, and it's also rich with really the kindest people with whom I've ever interacted. And this is my perception of Iraq, even after being held in captivity and really subjected to torture and really mistreatment for 2.5 years. Iraqis are just incredibly warm-hearted and very, very generous people. And this is actually something that I think is a key to the survival of Iraqis, because they've lived through very, very harsh periods. They're even, as Iraq was moving into modernity, feudal lords were very, very brutal, and people barely survived. And, communal solidarity played a big role. And then also in the 1990s, the UN, the entire global community imposed sanctions on Iraq following, the invasion of Kuwait. But the people who paid the highest price were the population. People were literally going hungry. And if it were not for the social solidarity, many Iraqis who are alive right now would be dead, simply because they wouldn't have survived otherwise. So people there are incredibly warm and generous. And even now, for example, you have people who can't find a job, and unemployment is very rife, and they basically live off of the largesse of their family and of their friends. And this helps them basically survive this economy, which is very, very distorted. They're basically an elite that is incredibly rich, people who are billionaires in dollars, who have assets all around the world. This includes the commanders of the militias, that includes political officials, this includes traders who are linked to them. Those individuals also control the media outlets in the country, and are able to kind of propagate a positive image for themselves, and also prevent any discussions of the systemic problems that exist in Iraq, or any kind of real in-depth discussion and pointing fingers. Then there is kind of a middle class that was created through state employment. So those are individuals who in the 1990s were overwhelmingly very poor, because the entire population was very poor because of the sanctions and the currency being worth nothing, basically. And they've basically owned their middle class status. So they have nice homes, they have nice cars. They owe it to being employed by the state. They are not necessarily kind of a socioeconomic middle class, because they can often be completely uneducated, and they simply got the job because they paid someone off, or because they have a relative, or because they know someone who got them this job. this includes, for example, militia members, right, who can be literally illiterate, unable to read and write. And this was the case with some of the people who held me captive. And yet they enjoy a salary that allows them in Iraq a middle-class lifestyle. And then there are millions and millions of people who are extremely, extremely poor. Those are people who are, employed in kind of very precarious employment for the most part. The private sector in Iraq is very weak. So basically, if you're not employed by the state, in most cases, your life is not comfortable. You're in a very precarious state, and you're constantly looking for a job, and you may be fired at any moment, and the salaries are very low. And you could be working in labor, kind of hard labor of like carrying, inside the market, heavy loads. You could be working in construction. You get injured, no one comes to help you. I mean, you're not going to get any kind of compensation from your employer. That's it. You lose your job. So if you walk around Iraq, and I'm referring here to Arab majority areas, so I'm excluding really, Kurdistan region, which is quite different. The state of infrastructure is very, very poor. It is actually often poorer in Shia areas, even though they're the majority, and then they're ones in charge since 2005. Than they are in Sunni areas, because Sunni areas enjoyed more investment during Saddam's time.
Right.
And then also, because of ISIS invading the area and massive damage, there was internationally funded reconstruction. In Al-Anbar, for example, in Mosul area. Exactly. So therefore, you have really just areas where poverty is completely shocking. You see people, piles of garbage and children sifting through them to look for plastic to sell. Sewage in the streets. Every winter, people are stuck, in slums that are very, very large in Iraq, the slums east of Baghdad. I spent a lot of time there because I would interview Sadrists, and that's where many of them live. Basically, they become impassable. People cannot go to their work because there's mud and water everywhere. They cannot basically go outside of their home. So it's really quite you see this, basically a very dysfunctional state where you have people who live a very comfortable life inside their home, but they too have to drive on roads that are very, very bad. If they go to a public hospital, the public hospital is going to be atrocious. So obviously they go to a private one. And schools are of a very, very low quality, and also universities, unfortunately. So I've spoken to people who have doctorates, who have master's degrees. And for example, a person who holds a master's degree from a university in southern Iraq, and she also teaches there English. She is not able to speak English with me. I interviewed her in Arabic, and when she tried to combine some English words to show that she knows English, they were wrong. So this is really, this is a result of a major brain drain that Iraq has suffered from, during Saddam's era, the very top intellectual elite left, but then also a much more massive brain drain in the 1990s during the sanctions era, and then after the US occupation. And simply, militias would assassinate people simply for being educated. It was not even, there were also kidnappings for ransom, which, at least has a certain perverted logic behind it. But there are also people who would just be assassinated simply to drive out the educated, the elite, so these forces can dominate politically.
I remember a conversation that I had with an Iraqi Shia person. We were flying, both of us, we were heading to Manama, and it was in 2003 from Istanbul. And we got to speak, and he told me, listen, I'm a Shiite, and I have family that were killed during the uprisal in 1991. And so on, and I hate Saddam Hussein, but obviously, the war didn't begin at that point yet. But I can tell you that there will be no Iraq without Saddam Hussein. And I wondered what he meant, because he didn't really want to expand on that. So even if he's in Manama, Saddam's agents still could get him, I guess, and so on, but that's what he said. And I wonder if he was, in a way, right. I mean, of course, nobody misses Saddam, God forbid, no. But the current structure, is it really better, than what they had in the past?
Yeah, there are actually people who do miss Saddam, and some of them, um, some of them are even Shia and Kurds, and they say it to, part of it is to provoke, to show how bad it is right now. But I think there is, I mean, I've heard it in private conversations with people that they genuinely miss those days. There was order, the Iraq was respected, which is kind of jingoistic kind of respect, but whatever. But I think, of course, Saddam's regime was a horrible dictatorship, and the Iraqi people, no human beings deserve to live under such a dictatorship where, entire families, like I've interviewed many Sadrists, and they suffered significant repression under the regime, particularly after the assassination of Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, Muqtada's father.
Yes.
And entire families were jailed, including grandma who is 70 years old and her granddaughter who is 10 years old. All of them jailed together simply because, a boy in this family, a teenager, participated in protests against the regime. So it was really a horrible period. But of course, what replaced it is also just awful, because all of these immense riches are flowing to the pockets of a very small group of people and the Iranian regime.
And the Iranian regime, this is exactly what I wanted to pick up. In what part do you feel that Iraq today is, partly is an Iranian province? And you said that, of course, the Iraqi militias, they are wealthy. They do not necessarily need Iran, but nevertheless, there is some dependency and there is some legitimacy, perhaps, and so on. And you see right now with Khamenei's funeral, they bring him to Najaf and Basra and all that.
Yeah, he's passing through Najaf and Karbala. Obviously, those are, they're the shrines of Imam Hussein and Imam Ali. So that's kind of the formal justification. But obviously, it's a way to show the popular support that this regime, enjoys in Iraq. Some of that support, I think, is genuine. Some of it's coerced. The governor at the province of Najaf ordered state employees to show up simply to attend. So, and of course, members of the militias will be told to go and attend. They're often told to go do this and participate in that to show us whatever political line. Whenever they're needed to show that Iran enjoys support inside Iraq. But of course, there are many people who oppose the Iranian regime who, Khamenei personally oversaw, as prime minister or as president, the war against Iraq. So obviously, it was a war of aggression that Iraq launched. But then in 1982, Iran was able to repel forces and then invade Iraq and kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Of course, then Khamenei also, when the uprisings both in Lebanon and Iraq started in October of 2019, he issued a tweet basically allowing for the killing of these protesters, and Qasem Soleimani traveled to Baghdad to coordinate the mass slaughter of these protesters perpetrated by the militias, the leading force among them being Qatar Hezbollah, the militia that kidnapped me. So many Iraqis don't forget that, but they're not really able to express themselves. People who have criticized for example, who expressed happiness about Khamenei's killing have been jailed in Iraq, not in Iran.
Yeah.
So I would say that Iraqi state institutions are very much penetrated by people who are essentially obeying Iran, and this is where their loyalty lies. And that this is something that the current administration is pushing very hard against. It has had some symbolic successes thus far, but it's hard to see whether this is something that is part of a more sustained and holistic policy that may produce an actual change in the balance of power inside Iraq and the loosening of Iran's grip over decision-making in Iraq.
Well, the very grim, situation, and I've recently read a fantastic book that I really, I read it actually twice because, it was just fascinating. It's called Stranger in My Own City. I bought it in England, and it's I think Oxford publication or something like this, of an Iraqi translator who became a freelancer who used to work with journalists during the wars starting from 2003 until I think 2019, and he just laid out this story of Iraq, how it's it was dismembered, disintegrated, and just going through the grinder of this eternal war, civil war, and otherwise by external powers, internal powers, and just miserable place, miserable people. I from the fate of Iraqis, I wanted to jump to something a little bit more personal, and I wanted to ask you, so you spent an unbelievable amount of time basically suffering, being jailed, and subjected to torture. And in the end of the day, you went there to collect materials for your PhD and so on, and probably enjoyed your time, in Iraq. You are telling about fantastic Iraqi people that you met, and I'm sure that it was an unbelievable experience. But I mean, really, was it worth it? Would you do?
No, of course it wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, even if I had been released much earlier and not after 903 days, it wouldn't have been worth it. Of course not. But clearly, I did not assess the risks in a correct manner. I was unaware of a phenomenon that is quite minor but does exist in Iraq, but because its victims are Iraqi, they don't speak, which is kidnappings for ransom. I was not kidnapped for my Israeli nationality. I was kidnapped for ransom, and only after the kidnappers opened my phone did they discover that I'm Israeli. And I was also not aware of the fact that the kind of social circle that I kept, which many of them were activists in the 2019-2020 protest movement that was very violently suppressed by the militias, that these circles were infiltrated by the militias, that they planted people within their realm whose job is to spy on activists. And I basically became a target of their surveillance, and then efforts that eventually proved successful to get me out of the house and to get me kidnapped. So I was not aware of all of these plans, basically, that these militias placed in the midst of these activists. And therefore, because of this, missing information, I ended up getting kidnapped.
Me myself, I'm not a stranger to dangerous and adventurous, trips, and so on. But I can tell you frankly, when I, heard about that, I was like, in my head, I was like, okay, all my nightmares basically came true. It's because, I've been to Lebanon, I've been to Syria, but I always went there for very, very short periods of time. Before my face will be too familiar for many people, and they would find out, and then again ransom or or political motivations, and so on. But from that, I wanted to basically to talk about your experience, because I'm following, of course, I'm following you from before the kidnapping story, and of course now, and I see how you write very fondly, for example, about Syria, the Syrian movement, that brought, in the end of the day, to the change that happened, in Syria and so on. How you talk warmly about Iraqis despite the kidnapping, and we do hear a lot, from people in Israel, that after everything that happened to Israeli people, after all of the terror, after all of the suffering, people are sensitive. They cannot listen to Arabic language. They don't want to be around Arabs. So basically making kind of excuses, that because of that, now we have to do this. And in your case, I mean, your attitudes didn't change. The kind of humanistic approach to people in general, then understanding that there are good people and there are bad people, kind of, but what did change, after this time in captivity?
Well, obviously my health deteriorated, so that's one thing. What did change? I think my political views or perception of Arabs or of people in general have not changed significantly because of my experience. I think I have been, because of developments in the region, and particularly October 7th, it affected how I view, for example, people who, in the West are label themselves or are part of the left. I think that it became clear after October 7th that many of them are not really driven by support for Palestinian rights, and it's more driven by hatred towards Israel, towards Israelis, sometimes even anti-Semitism. To me, that was something that was that became quite clear, I'd say even during the Syrian uprising and civil war, because the Assad regime perpetrated really atrocious crimes against Palestinian Syrians, particularly the Yarmouk camp. It was besieged in 2013. Many people inside the camp starved to death. They would eat, dead cats and dogs and leaves and animal food to survive. And it didn't arouse kind of mass protests around the world that you would.
Actually, it was hardly covered.
Exactly. I have friends who went to such protests in Europe, and it was just Syrians there. There wasn't this crowd that would usually go out and protest for Palestine. So it was clear to me that many there are not, genuinely. Palestine is kind of a totem for them, but they don't genuinely care about the lives of people there or Palestinians in general. And actually, many of them supported the Assad regime, right? Because they saw it as anti-imperialist or whatever, part of the Iranian axis. And I think that after October 7th and the growing criticism of Hamas from inside Gaza, and the very violent repression and kidnappings and torture that Hamas is perpetrating against the population to keep it silent, this is something that really did not garner any sympathy. On the contrary, some of them attack individuals inside Gaza who are suffering immensely, whom the entire international community failed. It failed to stop the horror that was brought upon them, the horrible crimes that Israel perpetrated against them. And yet they're judging people who are out there criticizing Hamas and saying, you did something really insane and irresponsible by attacking Israel. They say, like, you brought the Jews in, They were outside of Gaza, you brought them in, So I think that the fact that there's kind of very black and white thinking and, Israel is evil and therefore the other side is good. So you see people, waving Hamas flags or Hezbollah flags. I mean, Hezbollah waged an imperialist expansionist war inside Syria, also in Iraq. It sent members, and in Yemen, to intervene in civil wars in those countries to serve
also,
Iran's
of course,
interests.
all the civilians in Israel, most of it.
Yeah, of course, but I mean, the obviously, like, they don't view Israelis as meriting any compassion or whatever. But even if you just care about Arab lives, this militia perpetrated really horrific crimes, including, starvation of entire towns, massive ethnic cleansing of Sunnis from the areas of Homs, the areas south of Damascus, the areas east of Damascus, northern Hama, southern Idlib, the Aleppo countryside. All of these areas got ethnically cleansed by these Shia foreign militias, and it just never registered, it never merited attention. And now that they're fighting Israel, their record now appears to have been cleansed, and just this aspect of them being a tool of Iranian, projection of its influence is something that is completely disregarded.
Yeah, I was always puzzled by that, especially by figures who were Syrian, and suddenly, they explained how is it a good thing when Assad and Hezbollah are trying to kill more Syrians, and you're like thinking, so nothing makes sense here, So
No, I mean, but Assad is, I mean, it's really it's a mental illness. I mean, we shouldn't be judging people. I mean, it's really something that requires medical care.
Yeah. So continuing with the Syrian file, Syria is very close to your heart, I know, and you are a known figure in Syria long before this kidnapping happened, and all of that. In Israel, of course, there is very black and white perception of what is happening in Syria. Trump is forcing Israel and twisting its hand to to talk, but otherwise, Ashara is always called Giuliani.
Yes.
And his Al Qaeda past, of course, is always mentioned,
Yes.
and all of that. But I can tell you that I've been recently in many European cities where I met a lot of Syrians, and the vast majority of them, and those are people who are not minorities, Sunnis from prominent families, all of them, also were very, very skeptical about specifically this person and his group and their ability to change. So in your assessment, and again, I'm sorry that we don't have like an hour for every question that I ask you, because it deserves it. But what the hell is happening in Syria? Enlighten us.
Oh, wow. So Syria, emerged from 13 years of civil war and is really a destroyed and failed state. It's a very, very weak state. The state is largely dysfunctional. There are many ceremonies and foreign visits, and including a visit by Emmanuel Macron, the French president. But in reality, this is really a state that is largely is not present in the lives of its citizens. It's a very weak country that faces many, many challenges. That is massively destroyed. The Assad regime, the Russian Air Force, and the foreign Shia militias really destroyed the country. And there are entire towns that have no place for people to return to, from displacement camps or from refugee, from living as refugees abroad, because everything has been destroyed. In addition to entire neighborhoods in the city of Homs, for example, the city of Aleppo. This is a country that it will require immense infusions of foreign aid, and thus far they have not come, and very good management, and thus far that has not materialized, and many, many years for Syria to even reach the levels of development that it had in 2010. And at the time, it was behind many Arab countries.
Of course. And on Ashara, who is Ahmed Ashara?
Yeah, so I think in Israel, there is generally a tendency to view everything in black and white in the region. The level of analysis in Israel, if you open kind of, any TV channel, or the level of discussion is very, very low, to the point that it's embarrassing, really. Because of the ideological lens through which everything is viewed, and also kind of very much the security lens. Because most analysts are people who served for many years inside the Israeli military establishment, they view everything from the point of view, where is the next threat? And of course, the military analysts who talk on TV are all day long in conversation with people inside the military institutions, the security institutions, and therefore this is how they perceive reality, through this lens of constantly searching for new threats, instead of looking possibly for opportunities. So Ashar is a deeply pragmatic individual. He is someone who has reached power, became, the president of Syria, only 13 years after he crossed from Iraq into Syria and established Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al Qaeda arm in Syria, with a group of about 20 men. And they had initially very limited membership, very limited support, because of his constant quest for power, because of his willingness to use violence, including against fellow Sunni insurgents. He was able to to make his group the dominant player among rebel groups. And eventually around 2020 become the dominant force that is governing Idlib, which at the time was the last rebel-held province of Syria. Over the years, Ahmed al-Shara in the close circle of people around him, so this includes, for example, Anas Khattab, the Minister of Interior, Asad al-Shibani, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and a few other people. They faced multiple challenges from within and from without, from within Idlib and the population that they governed, and from the outside. The most major challenge was the fact that the Assad regime, with the foreign backing that it received from the Russian regime and Iran and its proxies, was simply stronger than the rebels. And therefore, to preserve Idlib and prevent its collapse, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham had to start cooperating with Turkey to preserve this territory. And Turkey didn't do so because it wants Assad toppled, or it is still hoping to achieve, any kind of grand scheme in Syria, but because it feared the influx of refugees. There were 3 million people living in this pocket of Idlib, displaced from the entire country. And therefore, the cooperation with Turkey caused internal fissures within the group and led to more radical elements to break off from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, establish Hurras ad-Din, establish other militias or subgroupings. Some of them were repressed, some of them were jailed.
Just for the sake of our listeners, I will just remind that Shara, he began with this group that is called Jabhat al-Nusra, and then it was relabeled as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So it's just, so the people will not be confused asking who is who.
Yeah. And also in 2016, they severed ties with Al-Qaeda, and this is a genuine severing of ties. So they sought to embed themselves inside the rebel kind of milieu rather than standing outside of it and constantly being in a state of struggle against it, and also become its leaders. And they did so through launching multiple attacks. Always Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and prior to Jabhat al-Nusra, was the party that is launching the attack against other rebel groups in this incessant quest for power and greater resources. So they also attack, for example, crossings between areas of control where you charge taxes, right? Mm-hmm. So they constantly strove to achieve greater power and greater territorial control. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham sought, to become the dominant player among, the opposition groups, the rebel groups against the Assad regime. And it also, in addition to having this external weakness and constant shelling from the Assad regime, so people are dying daily until, the very last days of, before Assad was overthrown. Basically, the regime would constantly shell this area and make it just unlivable for people to live in, particularly the area of the front lines. And this is actually what prompted the desire of the rebels to launch this attack, to push back the front lines. They did not expect that the regime will collapse so rapidly and that they'll be able to reach Damascus within days. This is why the operation was called deterrent aggression. It was not, let's topple the regime. They did not expect to be this successful. But so they're facing against a regime that for a while was more powerful and enjoyed Russian support and Iranian support. Of course, all of this changed after the war in Ukraine, and also after the immense changes that happened to the region because of October 7th, an Israeli campaign of assassinations of Iranian and Hezbollah officials inside Syria, and of course the pager war of 2024. So at the same time, while the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is facing this weakness that forces it into cooperation with Turkey, which is something very controversial to jihadists because Turkey is a secular state. And as I mentioned, this leads to these...
Wow, maybe not so secular anymore.
Yes, but it is formally a secular state, and the army is still a secular army. So this is something that is very problematic for many people inside Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and leads them to break off from the movement, basically. So you have a situation in which the more radical elements leave, and then also some of them who remain inside are pushed out or silenced. And And at the same time, they're dealing with the population that at the end of the day, they could not forge in their own image. You cannot make, this population of 3 million people that is from diverse areas of the country into this kind of a Salafi emirate. People just don't follow, these precepts and these beliefs. And therefore, they had to accommodate themselves to the population there. For example, there are many Sufis who live there. So they had to kind of accept the fact that Sufis live there and practice, because you don't want to constantly be facing off with an outside force, the regime, which is more powerful owing to foreign backing, and at the same time be fighting against your own population. So this led basically to changes in the way they conduct themselves and the way they govern, owing to the external and internal constraints that they faced. So it was not an ideological revision, it was basically pragmatism, pushing them more and more towards becoming kind of a typical Islamist rebel group, adopting the symbols of the revolution, which they previously refused. Previously, the current flag of Syria, if you raise it in Idlib, in areas under the control of Jabhat al-Nusra or HTS in its first years, you would be punished for it. I have friends who were jailed for it. Afterwards, they adopted this.
But, because we don't have a lot of time, I will be an advocate of the devil, and I will ask you, a typical security lens question. Okay, so we know that he's smart. We know that he can be pragmatic, that he can adapt to situations, that he's hungry for power. But is he still a jihadist? Does he still want to move, to make a Syria? Maybe, he cannot, do this pure Salafist vision, and so on. This is, again, in Syria, I think that it's quite impossible. It's better than I do, but still, I know many Syrians and they're very far away from that. But, we see what's going in the army, the curricula, and all of this, the ban on alcohol and many other things. And of course, the imams that they promote, to senior positions in mosques and so on. So maybe, is it true that, he's a jihadist in a suit?
So to be a jihadist, you need to have principles. You need to believe in something, right? I mean, those are terrible principles, but you believe in them. So for example, ISIS are jihadists. They went all the way and they lost everything because they followed their beliefs till the very end. Julani or Shara and the people who surround him are individuals who are marked first and foremost by their pragmatism, not by attaching themselves to any beliefs. And since coming to power, so in Idlib, they went through certain changes. Since coming to power, it is true. All the things that you've described are true. At the same time, there are also additional changes that are happening. For the first time, they have a woman in government. They have a non-Muslim Christian in government. They have judges who are women who are minorities. This is something that is very problematic from the point of view of Islamists. You basically have people who are non-Muslim who are judging over Muslims. This is a huge problem, yet they've accepted it. They've joined the international coalition against ISIS. That means you're cooperating, supposedly with the infidels against, supposedly fellow Muslims, which is something that was quite controversial within their ranks. So they're continuing to constantly adopt new decisions that show that they are first and foremost driven by the desire to stabilize their regime and maintain power and attract foreign investment. Oh, you cannot do this if you establish something akin to Afghanistan. And this is why you see them behaving very differently. Now, the people who are on the level of governors or people who are kind of second rank, those are individuals, sometimes many of them are very ideological, and they see now that we've come to power. It's our opportunity to make this into kind of an Islamic state. And this is why you see all these decisions, banning makeup or banning in Latakia or in government offices, or banning alcohol in Damascus, and then the decision is partially reversed or whatever. So these individuals do exist. They are the individuals who really are the decision makers on the level of kind of below this top 5 of decision makers. But the result has been that because this stratum of kind of second rank individuals have made so many embarrassing decisions, is that now the top 5, and particularly the top three, whom I've mentioned, want now every decision to be taken to them for their approval. So you now actually have a situation in which many things are not moving forward because the people at the top understand that the people below them are more ideological and make decisions that are very stupid and very damaging
So
to
it's again
Syria's reputation.
centralization of the state.
Exactly, and obviously you have 3 or 5 people cannot run a country, so you have basically many decisions that are stuck and are not moving forward because they have a limited number of hours in the day. But all of this is to say that for such a group of people who have really struggled so hard and so with such determination and such ruthlessness to reach power and then give it up to try and pursue some kind of a crazy jihadist fever dream, let's say launch attacks on Israel, or Shia in Lebanon and in Iraq who support the Iranian axis claim that these guys are coming to attack them, right? That they're going to come to attack Karbala. They're not going to do this. They have absolutely no interest in doing that. They want to stay in Syria. They want to build their power. They want to establish clearly quite an authoritarian regime with centralized power in the hands of this group of people and stay in power. And to do that, they need foreign investment. They need good relations with the West. And for that, you cannot be making all these, you cannot have a second Afghanistan in Syria.
Your take on the possibility of having some kind of rapprochement with Israel, because again, in Israel everything is black and white. One day you have Shara, Julani, he's a jihadist, terrible person. It's better that we will bomb his palace or something like this. The next day, maybe Syria will join Abraham Accords. And I never understand how quickly this change.
Everything, all this change occurred solely to U.S. pressure. It's not the result of, the top Israeli leadership becoming convinced that this is a good idea. I think it's very possible to reach such a security deal, and then hopefully over time, reach something that is more stable and. Israel can contribute in many ways to Syria, to its reconstruction, provide assistance to the population there. But this is something that will take time because of the way Israel conducted itself after Assad fell, invading the country, killing Syrians in the areas that it occupies, destroying homes, preventing people from accessing their fields. These areas which Israel invaded were also the areas to which Israel previously provided humanitarian and military assistance from 2013 until 2018 under the good neighborliness policy. Obviously, all of this was undone by this invasion and the brutalization of the population there, and of course, bombing of Damascus, this enraged Syrians. So I still believe that it is possible to reach a deal, and it's very important to reach it. This, continued abuse of the population of the South, obviously is very harmful to the Syrian population, but it also risks creating the very resistance that Israel will then use to justify long-term occupation of these areas. So it's very important to withdraw and end this occupation before this resistance, which is very natural to be the state of being occupied and being prevented from accessing your fields, etc., emerges.
But basically, and then we are concluding our conversation, unfortunately, because I, have still so many questions to ask you. We were talking about opportunities. In short, do you see opportunity opening it up after what happened in Syria, after the change of the regime, and then consequently in Lebanon? To the degree, I'm not dreaming today even of peace agreements and so on, but maybe something smaller in scale. So we saw something small happening in Lebanon, a memorandum of understanding. We see that there are negotiations with the Syrians. Do you think that there is really a chance, and what would need to happen to materialize it?
I think with the Syrians, it's really not much of a challenge. I spoke to a friend who works at the State Department. He agrees with me that basically, if Trump applies pressure to Netanyahu, it's possible to seal the deal in the span of a day of just negotiating and closing everything. Gradual Israeli withdrawal from the newly occupied territories, possibly some kind of an economic element, supply of Israeli gas to Syria. Syria is in much need of gas for the generation of electricity. In Lebanon, I'm much more pessimistic because of the weakness of the Lebanese state vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and also because of the way that Israel is conducting itself. The Israeli leadership, reached this deal with Lebanon that I think is very disfavorable to Lebanon. It basically allows Israel to maintain a state of occupation of Lebanon until Hezbollah is disarmed, completely. This is and Israeli officials, worse yet, since this deal was reached, as if it's not, lopsided enough and to the disfavor of Lebanon, they also declared that Israel is not going to pull out of any pilot zones except essentially, there are two pilot zones, one in which Israel doesn't occupy, Frun, and the other one which Israel does occupy, Zoutar al-Gharbiyya. So after that, don't expect us to do any more withdrawals. The only way the Lebanese government gains political capital is through Israeli withdrawal and the population returning to these areas. If it is not able to deliver that, Israel is undermining it. And therefore, I'm not hopeful.
Really difficult to imagine something of this kind happening prior to the Israeli elections. And then
unfortunately.
Okay, Liz, thank you so very much for being
a
ROPESCAST. We did not discuss the West Bank. We didn't discuss Gaza. And I know that you have a very strong, position and, feelings about what is happening there. So you have to promise us that you will come back for another installment, of this conversation. And again, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to the ROPESCAST, the independent voice of the Middle East. I'm your host, Ksenia Svetlova. To learn more about our work in ROPES to support our mission of building regional integration, or to listen to more episodes, please visit our website at ropes.org. You can also follow us on social media to stay updated on our latest initiatives and solidarity visits across the region. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we are looking forward to having you with us for our next episode. Shalom and salam.